The crowd is so loud that the sound has stopped being sound and becomes something else entirely, a pressure, a weather, a thing that moves through the chest and the walls of the throat and the bones behind the eyes. The streets of Rome are full to their edges. Flower petals cover the stone underfoot in drifts of white and yellow, already bruised by the passing of 10,000 sandals, and the air smells of crushed flowers and animals, and the particular smoke of a city burning offerings to its own moment of triumph. The general stands in his chariot at the center of it. He is elevated above the crowd by the chariot's height, elevated further by the dress he wears, the toga picta with its deep purple and gold, the laurel wreath already warm from the sun and from the heat of his scalp, and the faces below him are turned upward with the specific and total attention that a crowd gives only to someone it has decided, at least for this hour, to adore completely. He can hear his own name in the noise, not distinctly, not as a word, but as a shape within the sound, repeated and repeated until it is less a name than a fact of the air. The horses move forward at the slow ceremonial pace, and the petals fall, and the crowd contracts and expands like something breathing, and the general's face holds the expression that has been practiced and earned, and that means I have done this, and I am worthy of the praise being given. Beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touch, stands a single slave. The slave's clothing is plain. His face is neither joyful nor afraid. He has been placed here by the institution of the Roman triumph, not as an attendant, but as a philosophical instrument, assigned one task for the duration of the procession, and that task is to speak into the general's ear at intervals so quiet that the nearest soldier cannot hear the words. The city roars, the petals fall, the general receives the adulation of an empire, and then the slave leans in and says it, Memento Mori, remember that you will die. The words are not a curse, they are not a rebuke, they are not the act of an enemy or a critic or a man trying to diminish the greatness of the moment. They arrive, if anything, as a kind of gift, the one true thing offered in a sea of celebrations that are by nature the province of flattery and spectacle and the particular unreality of perfect public triumph. The slave leans back, the chariot moves forward, the crowd continues its roar, and the general, if he has taken the words in the spirit in which they were intended, returns the adulation of the crowd with something changed behind his eyes, not humility as performance, not gravity put on for effect, but the genuine quality that the Romans associated with philosophical clarity, the awareness that the man standing in the chariot and the man who will one day lie still are the same man, and that knowing this does not diminish the chariot at all, it deepens it. This was the practice, not a philosophy discussed in schools, not an argument written down for later generations to examine and debate, but a practice, a living procedure built into the architecture of public ceremony, so that the most powerful man in a room could not entirely escape the most important fact about his condition. The Romans were not an especially morbid people, and they built aqueducts and legal codes and roads that ran so straight they seemed planned by a force more geometric than human. They held games and celebrated victories and built houses of considerable comfort and enjoyed their wine and their conversation and their baths with evident pleasure. And within all of that, they found a specific place for the quiet reminder, not to spoil the pleasure, not to overshadow the triumph, but to keep the man inside the triumph honest about what he was. Marcus Aurelius would have understood the gesture completely. He was emperor for nearly 2 decades, the most powerful man alive in his time, and he spent the mornings of many of those years writing in the privacy of a journal never intended for other eyes, the thoughts that kept him from confusing his role with his nature. The Meditations is a strange document. It reads not like the reflections of a philosopher performing wisdom for an audience, but like the notes of a man genuinely trying to get something right before the day begins and the world makes its demands. He writes to himself, he corrects himself, he sets down arguments he has already made and makes them again, as if repetition is the only way to keep them available through the noise of governing an empire. Among the things he returns to most often is the observation that everyone ends alike: Alexander the Great and his mule driver, the conqueror and the slave, the philosopher and the laborer. He sweeps his eye across the centuries and sees the same thing everywhere: the famous and the obscure, the powerful and the forgotten, arriving at the same destination with no distinction preserved. He does this not to induce despair. Despair would have been the opposite of his intention. He does it to dissolve the anxious grasping that attaches itself to fame and legacy and the opinion of posterity, which he considered some of the most reliable sources of unnecessary suffering available to a man. If the destination is shared, then the urgency that drives the scramble for distinction is based on a misreading, and if the urgency drains away, something else becomes available. The quality of attention a person can bring to what is actually present here, on this morning, in this room, in this specific light. What Marcus Aurelius was practicing, sitting in his quarters before dawn, writing the names of emperors who had seemed permanent, and noting quietly that they were gone, was the philosophical discipline that his tradition called the daily confrontation with mortality, not as an exercise in morbidity, but as the foundation of equanimity. The word equanimity is worth slowing down for. It is not contentment. It is not the absence of feeling. It is not the performance of calm. It is the specific psychological state that results from having genuinely internalized the shape of one's condition, having looked at it clearly and at length until the looking is no longer frightening but simply accurate, the way a person can learn to look at the depth of the ocean, not with the terror of the first glimpse, but with the considered stillness of someone who has sat with it long enough to stop expecting it to be otherwise. The Stoic tradition that Marcus Aurelius and Seneca both inhabited held mortality reflection to be not an optional exercise for the philosophically inclined, but the necessary foundation of anything that could honestly be called a good life. Seneca argued this with a directness that has not softened with the centuries. He wrote his letters to Lucilius with the urgency of a man who has watched too many people arrive at old age, having spent the available years on things that at the end seem to have consumed the time without filling it. The letter he was always writing, in some form, was the same letter: claim yourself for yourself before the time runs out. He was not talking about withdrawal from the world or contempt for pleasure, or the kind of philosophical austerity that makes life smaller in order to make it safer. He was talking about the orientation from which a life is lived, whether the person at the center of a life knows what they value, and whether their days bear any genuine relation to that knowledge. To live with mortality in mind, in the Stoic account, was to live with one's priorities visible. The awareness of an end gives the days before it a shape they would not otherwise have. Without the horizon, the days can seem, in practice, infinite, not in any cosmological sense, but in the way that available time can seem expandable when it is not being accounted for, in the way that a person can tell themselves that the thing they most want to do, or say or be, will happen eventually in the fullness of some future time that is always available and never quite arrived. The mortality reminder removes this particular comfortable fiction, not cruelly, not as an act of despair, but with the precision of a hand clearing away the mist on a window, so that what is actually outside becomes visible in its true distance for the first time. Europe in the 14th century was not thinking about any of this in the abstract. The Black Death arrived between 1347 and 1351 and killed, in some estimates, between a third and half of the continent's population. It did not select by rank or piety or virtue. It moved through cities and monasteries and royal courts with an indifference to distinction that was, in its own way, philosophically instructive, though no one had asked for the lesson in that form. The physical experience of it, the speed of it, the arbitrariness of it, the way it arrived in a household and departed, having made its choices without any discernible principle, produced, in the art and thought that followed, one of the most sustained cultural engagements with mortality in Western history. On the whitewashed interior walls of churches across France and Germany and the Low Countries, artists began to paint what they called the danse macabre, the dance of death. The image recurs with enough consistency across different hands and different decades to suggest that it was answering something real in the culture's need, something that could not be addressed by doctrine alone. A line of figures moves across the plaster in slow procession. At the head of the line stands a pope in full regalia, tiara and vestments, and the gold of the office rendered carefully, the dignity of the institution present in every painted fold. Beside him dances a skeletal figure with a grin that is not triumphant and not cruel, but simply impartial. Further down the line, an emperor, a cardinal, a knight, a merchant, with the specific prosperous weight of a man accustomed to comfort, a lawyer, a peasant, a mother carrying an infant. And at the end, or perhaps the beginning, the ordering is never quite clear, which is part of the point. A small child, painted with the tenderness that even didactic medieval art found for children. The skeleton moves between them all with identical ease. It does not strain at the pope. It does not condescend to the peasant. Its feet are the same feet in every frame, and the dance it performs with each figure is the same dance. The visual argument is not complicated, and it was not meant to be. It was meant to be looked at by a person standing in a church who had recently lost someone to the plague, or who knew they might, or who simply lived in a world where the arbitrariness of death had become for a generation impossible to pretend away. And the argument it made that no accumulation of wealth or title or piety purchases exemption from the universal condition was not a cause for despair in the tradition that produced it. It was a cause for reorientation. If no earthly achievement finally matters in the way that earthly achievement presents itself as mattering, then something else must be what matters. The Danse Macabre is in this reading not a painting about death, but a painting about what deserves genuine attention in the life that precedes it. There is a certain quality of honesty in art that is made under pressure. The Danse Macabre was made under extreme pressure, in a culture that had been forced to look directly at something it could not have chosen to look at, and the looking produced images of unusual clarity. The skeleton in the dance does not appear threatening. It appears, if anything, patient. It has been waiting outside every door in Europe for everyone who will eventually open theirs, and it is entirely willing to wait as long as it takes. And the waiting contains no impatience, because the outcome has never been in question. What the images offer the person standing before them is not terror, but the specific kind of quiet that sometimes follows the full acknowledgement of a fact one has been partly avoiding, the relief, quiet and a little strange, of simply knowing where one stands. Long before the plague altered European consciousness, and on the far side of the Mediterranean, Herodotus recorded a custom practiced at Egyptian banquets that carries the same philosophical instruction in an entirely different tone. The Egyptians, he noted, passed among their dinner guests at feasts a carved wooden figure, a small effigy of a reclining corpse, rendered with some care, placed in the hands of each guest in turn before being passed to the next. The person who received it held it briefly, long enough to look at it, long enough to feel its weight in the hands, before the next pair of hands reached out. And the dinner continued. The wine was poured. The conversation moved forward. The laughter of the room, and it was, Herodotus makes clear, a room where laughter was expected and welcome, continued undisturbed. This detail has a quality that is easy to misread at first. It might seem like a morbid interruption, a pause of funereal gravity inserted into pleasure to diminish it, but the practice, considered with a little more patience, reveals something else. The carved figure was not there to stop the pleasure, it was there to complete it. The Egyptians who designed this custom understood something about the structure of enjoyment that is not always obvious, that pleasure exists most fully in the awareness of its own passing, that the meal tastes of what it is, rather than what it appears to be, only when the one eating it knows, in some genuine and felt sense, that not every meal is guaranteed. The figure passed from hand to hand at a lavish banquet is not a memento of grief, it is an intensifier of presence. The person who receives it and holds it for a moment before passing it on is being invited not to stop eating, but to eat with a different quality of attention, the attention available only to someone who has, for a moment, genuinely considered the alternative. The room in that image continues to be warm. The oil lamps send their light across the faces of the guests. The cups are full. The carved figure moves around the table, each pair of hands receiving it in turn, and each release of it back into the circuit is a small return to the pleasures of the evening, not despite the figure's presence, but because of it. The 17th century in the Low Countries produced a different visual tradition than the danse macabre, but one that carries the same philosophical instruction with even greater formal precision. The Dutch and Flemish painters who developed the vanitas genre were working with images rather than arguments, but the images they made have arguments embedded in their arrangements with the patience of philosophers who also happen to be exceptional technicians of light and surface and material texture. The word vanitas comes from Ecclesiastes, vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The preacher who wrote that was not counseling despair. He was making an observation about the nature of earthly accumulation, which he had surveyed at length and found to leave, in the end, no permanent residue. In a painter's studio in 17th century Delft, a skull sits at the center of a carefully arranged table. Beside it, a candle burned down to a thumb's length of wax, the flame steady in the still air of the studio. A glass of wine, full when the arrangement was set, has begun to lose its edge, the surface of it slightly flat now, the particular freshness of a newly poured glass already gone. A spray of cut flowers, white and generous at the moment of their placing, has begun the slow process of bowing at the stem, the petals still holding, but the direction of their future now visible in the downward lean. An hourglass turns so that its sand is still running, its last grains visible in the lower chamber. A book, lying open at a page that will not be read today. The painter adjusts the composition by a single degree. The skull moved 1/4 of an inch to the left. The candlestick realigned to catch the light differently. This is not decoration. Every object in the arrangement has been selected with philosophical intention. The skull is the oldest symbol in the language, the clean and final form of the thing all the others point toward. The guttering candle is time itself, measured in the only direction it runs. The glass losing its freshness is pleasure as it exists in reality, rather than aspiration, present, real, already beginning to pass. The flowers confirm that beauty is biological before it is aesthetic, subject to the same conditions as everything else that grows. And the hourglass makes the system explicit. The running of it is not stopping, and the arrangement being painted is being painted against the running. What the Vanitas tradition argued, and it argued with great care and deliberate craft, was not that beauty is worthless because it passes. The argument ran in precisely the opposite direction. The objects on that table in Delft are rendered with extraordinary attention. The painter has taken the time to capture the specific quality of light on the curve of the skull's dome, the texture of the flower petals at their current degree of opening, the clarity of the wine that has just begun to lose it. The care given to the painting of transient things is itself the argument. These things deserve this much attention because they are passing. The transience is not a defect in them. It is the condition that makes the attention appropriate and honest and in its way reverent. The theological context of the 17th century Dutch Vanitas painting matters to the tradition, but is not necessary to appreciate what the images do. The painters working in this tradition understood themselves to be making a moral argument, rooted in Ecclesiastes and in the Christian theology of their time, contrasting earthly accumulation with the certainty of death as a way of directing attention toward what endures beyond accumulation. But the images work outside that theological frame as well, for the reason that the instruction they carry does not depend on any particular metaphysics. They depend only on the observation that everything visible and present has a duration, and that this duration is finite, and that knowing this does not make the visible and present less, but more. The painter in the Delft studio sets down the palette and steps back from the canvas. He looks at the skull at the center of his composition, and then at the canvas where the skull has become paint, and the question he is holding, probably not consciously, probably simply as the quality of attention present in the room, is the question that every person who has seriously arranged a Vanitas still life has held, whether an object rendered honestly, with full attention to its transience, becomes less or more by the rendering. The answer the tradition gives in image after image is that the rendering makes it more, not because the art transforms the object, but because the act of careful looking that includes the acknowledgement of duration, is the only looking that is fully honest, and honesty of this kind turns out to have a quality that resembles, at its depth, a form of love. Seneca was old and near the end of his life when he wrote the letter in which he asked the question that had been asking itself through every line he had ever written to Lucilius, whether he had truly claimed his own time or had merely spent it. The table in front of him was covered in letters, not just the ones he was writing, but the ones he had written, the whole correspondence that had been his primary philosophical work for the years of its composition. He wrote by lamplight. The house was quiet around him, and the sentence he was forming concerned not his legacy or his reputation or the reception his philosophical works would eventually receive, but something more immediate and more honest, whether the life he had lived had been genuinely his, in the sense that it had been spent on what he valued rather than what had presented itself as available and demanding. He had spent time in exile. He had spent time at court. He had accumulated considerable wealth, which he was thoughtful enough to be uncomfortable about, and honest enough not to entirely condemn. He had written plays and essays and letters and philosophical arguments of various kinds, and he had held political positions and lost them and been forced finally to face a death he had not chosen. And through all of it, he had kept returning to the same set of questions in the same measured register, as if the returning itself were the philosophical practice, as if the point were not to arrive at a final answer, but to keep the question alive and genuine and in front of him. What Seneca was doing with mortality reflection was what Marcus Aurelius was doing in his dark, quiet room before dawn, and what the Roman triumph was doing with its slave and its whispered words, and what the medieval wall painters were doing with their lines of skeletal dancers, and what the Egyptians were doing with their carved figure passed from hand to hand at a feast, and what the painters of Delft were doing with their careful arrangements of passing things. They were not making arguments about death. They were making arguments about life, about the specific quality of attention that becomes available when the limited duration of the available time is not avoided but acknowledged, held, and allowed to do its quiet and entirely benign philosophical work. The skull on the table in Delft does not threaten the flowers beside it. It simply names what the flowers already are: temporary, genuinely beautiful, present in a way that will eventually stop being available, worth the full attention of anyone who is paying attention. The flowers are not less beautiful for the skull's presence. They are, in the specific emotional grammar of the Vanitas tradition, more beautiful because more honestly seen, and because honesty of this kind, extended fully to something that is genuinely beautiful and genuinely passing, produces a quality of feeling that is neither grief nor simple pleasure, but something that contains both and is made more spacious by the containing. Every culture that has looked at human life with patience and honesty seems to have arrived, eventually, at the same quiet observation, not through communication with each other, and not because they were working from a shared source. The Roman slave whispering in the general's ear, and the Egyptian host passing the carved figure around his banqueting table, and the medieval fresco painter working his line of dancers across the whitewashed plaster, and the Dutch painter adjusting the skull at the center of his composition were not in conversation. They were arriving, each in their own time and language and social form, at the same small and inexhaustible truth that knowing what a thing is, knowing fully, without evasion, is the beginning of knowing how to be with it, and that a life lived with that knowing present is a different life from one in which the knowing has been carefully arranged to remain at the edge of awareness, where it cannot trouble anything, but cannot deepen anything either. The Vanitas painter lifts the skull from the table where it has been sitting at the center of his composition. He holds it with both hands, the way one holds something that is simultaneously familiar and strange, something that is at once an object in a studio in Delft and the oldest argument in the language. The canvas before him is nearly finished. The light has moved across the afternoon, and the candle beside the composition has burned lower while he worked, which means the painting and the thing it depicts have both been running their hours in the same direction. He will set the skull back down in a moment and make the final adjustments. The cut flowers will hold a few more days before they need to be replaced. The wine in the glass has gone entirely flat, and what the painter holds in his hands, in that studio, in that century, in that city, is not a symbol of what terrifies, but an emblem of what clarifies, the plain fact of finitude that every tradition examined in this quiet survey has found, on careful inspection, to be not the opposite of beauty, but its persistent and honest companion. Every culture that has sat with this long enough has found the same thing at the end of the sitting: not despair, not dread, not the cold comfort of a lesson learned and then put aside. Something quieter and more durable than any of those, a kind of clear-eyed fondness for the world as it actually is, offered its full attention precisely because it will not always be available to receive it, held carefully for exactly as long as it can be held. Before the rest of the palace had stirred, Marcus Aurelius was already at his table. The room was small for an emperor's room, dark still, the oil lamp throwing a narrow orange light across the writing surface, the shadows behind him thick and undisturbed. The stylus moved across the wax with the particular quiet sound of a task that has been taken up many mornings before. Not a scratching, but something softer, more considered, the sound of a mind moving at the pace it prefers when no one is watching. Outside, Rome was beginning its earliest sounds, a card on stone, a distant gate, the first birds finding their register in the dark above the Palatine. He did not seem to hear any of it. The words forming under his hand were not addressed to the city, or to the empire, or to any reader he expected. They were addressed to himself, in the most honest direction a person can write. The name he had just set down was Hadrian, before that Trajan, before that Augustus. He was making a list, and it was a particular kind of list, not a genealogy or a record of succession, but something closer to a meditation on disappearance. Each of these names had once organized the world. Each of them had been the center around which enormous human effort revolved, the fixed point of entire political systems, entire armies, entire philosophies of governance. And each of them now was gone in a way that made the word asterisk, gone asterisk, feel too light for what had actually happened. They were not merely absent, they were as though they had never been, at least from the perspective of the morning that was brightening slowly outside this particular window. Marcus was not writing this to frighten himself. That was the important thing, and he knew it. The stoic tradition he had inherited from Epictetus through the writings of teachers he would never meet, a tradition already old when it reached him, had a specific understanding of what this kind of survey was for. It was not meant to induce the cold feeling that nothing matters. It was not a philosophical dare, a way of making oneself confront the void at dawn in order to feel the sharpness of being alive by contrast. The purpose was quieter than that and more useful. What Marcus was doing by setting down the names of emperors who had seemed permanent was dissolving something, a specific category of anxiety that he identified as one of the great sources of human restlessness. The anxiety that comes from wanting things that cannot be held, the craving for fame, for legacy, for a name that survives. He was, in the most deliberate and practiced way, loosening the grip of that craving by examining what it actually produces. Alexander the Great, he wrote elsewhere, and Alexander's mule driver had come to the same end. Not with bitterness, with the steady-eyed calm of someone examining a natural fact. The lamp was burning, the city was waking, he kept writing. What the Stoics understood about mortality was something that can look like morbidity from the outside and feels from the inside like relief. The relief of seeing clearly, the feeling that arrives when a mind stops defending itself from a fact it has always known and simply looks at it directly and without flinching, and finds that the looking does not destroy anything important, but only clarifies what was already there. Marcus had been emperor of Rome for years before this particular morning. He had commanded campaigns on the Danube. He had managed the vast administrative machinery of an empire that circled the Mediterranean. And still, or perhaps because of all this, he returned every morning to the same private writing and the same unfashionable questions, not the questions of policy or strategy, but the questions of what a human life is for, and how much of his own life he had actually inhabited, and what, if anything, he had genuinely done with the time. These questions had texture for him. They were not abstractions. There is a word for what Marcus was practicing, though the word sounds more severe than the practice itself feels. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum the premeditation of what can be lost. The deliberate, regular turning of the mind toward the possibility of loss, including the final loss, the loss of the life itself. The name makes it sound like an exercise in bracing for disaster, but the experience of it, as Marcus and his teachers describe it, is almost the opposite. When a person genuinely practices this, holds the possibility of loss in mind, not as a distant abstraction, but as a real consideration, what happens is not a darkening of the day, but a strange brightening of it. What had been invisible becomes visible. What had been taken for granted stands forward, briefly, in its actual weight. He paused in his writing. Outside, the first full light was arriving. The argument behind the practice was simple, which did not make it easy. The human mind, left to its ordinary operation, habituates to its circumstances with remarkable speed. A thing that was once felt as a gift becomes, after enough exposure, simply the background of the day. The person who spent years wanting a particular kind of morning light to fall through a particular kind of window eventually stops seeing the light entirely, because nothing requires them to see it. It becomes furniture. The Stoics had noticed this, as had everyone else who has ever paid attention to how quickly pleasure becomes ordinary. But where most philosophical accounts of this phenomenon stop at lament, the Stoic account goes somewhere more useful. The habituation can be interrupted. It can be deliberately reversed, not by acquiring new things, but by considering the absence of what is already here. To hold, for a moment, the thought that this morning might not come again, not as a dramatic confrontation with death, but as a gentle refocusing of attention, is to restore the morning to something approaching its actual weight. This was not a sad practice. This was, in the Stoic understanding, the most efficient path to genuine appreciation that a person can take. Marcus set the stylus down. He had been writing about Alexander and his mule driver, and now he was sitting in the ordinary morning light, and the light was doing what it always did, falling where it always fell, and it was enough. This was the destination the Stoics were always pointing toward, not resignation, not the passive acceptance of whatever comes, but something livelier and more grounded than most people associate with the word equanimity. The equanimity of the person who has genuinely understood their situation. The calm that follows, not from avoiding the hard fact, but from having met it enough times that the meeting itself becomes unhurried and even companionable. Far from Rome, in the city of Nicopolis, in a small building with a plain interior, Epictetus was teaching. He had been a slave. This was not incidental to his philosophy. He had lived, for a significant portion of his life, in a condition where the things that most people consider the ground of a self, the ability to determine where one goes, what one does with one's body, what one's time is spent on, had been entirely outside his control. And from this position, rather than the position of comfortable distance, he had arrived at what would become the most foundational distinction in the Stoic tradition. Some things are up to us, everything else is not. The boundary between those two categories, once genuinely understood, is the most important line in philosophy. The students sitting with him in that plain room were, like students everywhere, inclined to find the distinction obvious when stated, and almost impossible to hold when put into practice. The number of things genuinely up to us, Epictetus kept telling them, is smaller than anyone at first believes. Our opinions, our impulses, toward and away from things, our choices about how to engage with what comes. Everything else, the body, reputation, property, the opinion of others, The events of the world belongs to the second category, and death, he said, with the particular steadiness of someone who was not performing the point, but had lived it, death belongs to the second category completely. This did not mean death should be ignored. The opposite, the knowledge of death held properly in the right part of the mind, does a specific kind of work that nothing else can do. It places everything else in proportion. The anxiety about reputation, it loses some of its grip when held beside the certainty of death. The obsession with what other people think, with the maintenance of a particular image, with the accumulation of standing and advantage, these concerns tend to recede when genuinely measured against the brevity of the time available. Epictetus was not arguing that these things don't matter. He was arguing that the fear of death, unexamined and held at arm's length, actually enlarges these lesser anxieties by filling the psychological space that should be occupied by the larger fact. The person who has honestly confronted their mortality is paradoxically less preoccupied with death than the person who has not, because the honest confrontation removes the anxiety that was feeding on evasion, and what remains is simply the fact, which is much lighter than the fear. His students wrote these things down. They argued about them afterward, in the way that students argue, pressing at the edges, looking for the places where the position becomes uncomfortable. Epictetus seemed to find this useful. There is a word for the category of things outside our control. In Epictetus's terminology, asterisk, ta ektos, asterisk, the externals. And there is a word for what remains when the externals are correctly understood as externals, asterisk, procheresis, asterisk, the faculty of choice, the inner citadel, the one thing that circumstance cannot reach without permission. The entire Stoic practice of mortality reflection is, at its deepest level, an exercise in relocating the self from the externals, the body, the reputation, the continuation of life, to the asterisk procheresis asterisk, the thing that chooses, not because the body doesn't matter, or because death is not real, but because the person who has accomplished this relocation is genuinely free, in the only way that Epictetus believed freedom to be possible. He had been a slave. He knew what he was talking about. The plain room in Nicopolis was quiet for a moment after the lesson. Across the decades and the miles, in another room entirely, in the particular circumstances of the late Roman Empire, another person was sitting with similar questions in a far less settled condition. Seneca had been, for most of his adult life, one of the most powerful men in the world. He had been tutor and advisor to Nero, the architect of an imperial style, a man whose correspondence traveled the length of the empire and whose philosophical essays circulated in copies he had never seen. He was enormously wealthy. He was by most external measures as successful as the world's measures allowed, and he had spent decades in private letters to a friend he had never met in person, a younger man named Lucilius, working as a procurator in Sicily, arguing that all of this was beside the point. What Seneca was arguing across these letters was something that requires a particular kind of honesty to hear properly. Time, he told Lucilius, is the only possession that is genuinely yours. Not money, not property, not the influence that comes from proximity to power. These things can be taken and given back, lost and replaced, accumulated and scattered. Time cannot be replaced. Time, once spent, is gone in a way that no other loss quite matches. And the error that most people make, the error that Seneca returned to in letter after letter, with the patient urgency of someone who believes the point is not yet fully heard, is treating time as though it were the least precious thing they own. He wrote to Lucilius, asterisk, recede in tie ipsa, asterisk, withdraw into yourself. Not a retreat from the world, but a gathering, the practiced act of reclaiming the hours from the various ways they leak out of a life, unnoticed. He had watched powerful men spend their entire lives waiting for the moment when they would finally begin, waiting for the right position, the right circumstances, the completion of this particular obligation before the real work of living could start. And what he wanted to say, in as many letters as it took to say it, was that the waiting was the error. The life was not arriving. The life was here, in the letters, in the morning, in the small windows of genuine attention that open and close without announcement. Every hour given to postponement is an hour that does not return. Asterisk. Differentiate später transcarity. Asterisk, while we delay, life passes. Seneca had looked at his own life with this kind of honesty, and what he found there was not entirely comfortable. He had spent years in the proximity of power, making the compromises that proximity requires. He had accumulated wealth that he would spend pages arguing was not important. He had lived, in certain respects, at some distance from the philosophy he was writing. The letters to Lucilius are not the letters of a man who has mastered his subject. They are the letters of a man working through it, returning to the same problems from new angles, finding that the argument clarifies as he writes it without the problem ever fully dissolving. This makes them more useful, not less. The philosophy that arrives in clean, finished form has often been smoothed past the places where it still cuts. Seneca's letters have not been smoothed. The resistance is still in them. What he was insisting on, underneath the arguments about time and distraction and the proper use of a life, was something both practical and urgent. The urgency was not fear. Seneca was genuinely not afraid of death, or at least not afraid in the way that fear typically operates, as a contraction, a recoiling, a seeking of distance. His relationship with death was something more like acquaintance. He had considered it carefully, had held it in his mind at length, had thought through what it was and what it was not, and had arrived at a position that had the texture of completed work rather than ongoing dread. Death was coming. He had known this for a long time. The question that remained, and that he returned to every morning like a practice, was whether he had claimed his own time or merely moved through it. He wrote the question down once in a form that has stayed intact across the centuries. Asterisk, ita fac, mi Lucili, vindica te tibi. Asterisk, do this, my Lucilius, claim yourself for yourself. The verb he chose, asterisk, vindica asterisk, had legal resonances in Latin. It was the verb used for the formal claiming of a free person who had been wrongly held as a slave. Claim yourself, as if the self were property under illegal detention, as if the proper authority had not yet stepped forward to assert its rightful claim. This was not metaphor for effect. This was the philosophical substance, that the average person goes through the average life, having never made this claim, having allowed the days to be distributed among whatever demands arrived first and loudest, and having arrived at the end of the life with no clear accounting of where any of it went. The evening deepened outside the window where he was writing. He picked up the letter again. There is a specific quality to Seneca's prose in these letters that is worth sitting with. He was a brilliant stylist. Everyone who read him in his lifetime, and has read him since, can tell this, but the quality of the prose that matters most for these questions is not its elegance. It is its honesty about the gap between knowing and doing. He knew, intellectually and completely, that time was the substance of a life, and that its squandering was the specific form of loss that could not be recovered. He also knew, with the same completeness, that he had squandered some of his own. These two things sat side by side in his writing, without one canceling the other. Philosophy, he seemed to be saying, does not produce perfect practitioners. It produces people who can see more clearly, which is not the same thing as people who always do well by what they see. This is a more honest relationship with philosophy than most traditions offer. Epictetus had said that the test of philosophy is not what a person can argue, but what a person does. Marcus had said the same thing in his own way, checking his actions against his principles in the private dark of the morning journal, finding the gap between them and noting it without dramatic self-reproach. And Seneca had said it in the particular way of a man who knew the gap was large in places and who kept writing anyway because the writing was part of the closing of it. Philosophy as practice rather than philosophy as position. The distinction matters because it changes what the philosophy is for. If philosophy is a set of correct positions to be held, then the gap between the position and the life is a failure. If philosophy is a practice, a discipline of returning, of asking, of noticing, then the gap is simply the material the practice works with. The practice the Stoics were describing had a daily structure. It was not reserved for crisis or for the formal setting of a lecture room. It was meant to be woven into the texture of the ordinary day, appearing at the beginning and the end and at intervals within it. In the morning, the consideration that this day might be the last, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet orientation, a brief reweighting of what matters. During the day, the practiced attention to what is genuinely within one's choice, and what is not, the willingness to release what belongs to the second category without excessive energy. At the evening, something closer to what Seneca describes in his letters, a review, a reckoning without self-punishment, a return to the question of whether the day has been genuinely inhabited. It was not a heavy practice. Done properly, the Stoics seem to agree, it becomes light with repetition, not lighter in its philosophical seriousness, but lighter in the sense of becoming more natural, less effortful, eventually as ordinary as breathing. The person who has asked the morning question enough times begins to ask it without quite noticing the asking. The orientation it produces becomes the background of the day rather than an interruption of it. This is what practice means in a tradition that has thought carefully about what practice produces. There is an image that stays close to the Stoic account of mortality and that comes from outside Rome entirely, though the Stoics would have recognized it immediately. At the beginning of a morning, any morning, an ordinary one, a person at a table with their breakfast, and the window showing the day's weather, and the sounds of whoever else is in the house, a version of the morning that has happened before, and will, if things continue as they do, happen again, and the quality of attention brought to it that comes from having held, even briefly, the thought that it might not always be here. Not the dramatic thought, not the full philosophical apparatus, just the quiet weight of that consideration, resting in the background, like the sound of the city continuing outside, present but not demanding. The breakfast looks different, not more vivid in any theatrical sense, just present in a way it wasn't before the thought arrived. This is what the Stoics were describing, and what Marcus was practicing at his table in the dark, and what Epictetus was trying to teach in the plain room in Nicopolis, and what Seneca was arguing for across all those letters sent from Rome to Sicily. Not a confrontation with death, not a dwelling in morbidity or loss, something closer to the opposite, a technique for restoring ordinary experience to something like its actual value, which is considerably higher than ordinary experience is usually allowed to feel. The question Seneca returned to in his letters was not whether death was something to fear. He had settled that question, or settled it, as much as it can be settled from the inside of a life that has not yet ended. The question he returned to was the practical one, the one that requires constant maintenance because the pressure of daily life constantly works against it. Whether the hours as they pass are being genuinely claimed, whether the attention is present in the morning and the evening and the conversations that might matter, whether the person spending time is inhabiting the time or merely passing through it on the way to something else that never quite arrives. He had a word for the people he admired most in this regard, asterisk sapiens, asterisk the wise person, not the clever person, not the well-read person, not the person with the most polished arguments. The wise person, in Seneca's usage, is the one who has genuinely understood the situation, the brevity, the irreplaceability, the specific way that distraction consumes what cannot be recovered, and who organizes the day accordingly, not perfectly, not without stumbling, but with the orientation correct and the question present, and the willingness to return to it even after many days of forgetting. The asterisk sapiens, asterisk was not common. Seneca admitted this freely. He did not know if he had met one, or if he himself had ever reached the condition, even briefly. But the improbability of the ideal did not reduce its usefulness as an orientation. The person who falls short of a standard they have genuinely understood falls short in a direction that is worth traveling. The person who never encounters the standard has nowhere particular to be falling toward. In the year 65, by order of the emperor he had once tutored, Seneca was told to end his own life. What happened in those final hours has been recorded by Tacitus with the particular care that Roman historians brought to significant deaths, which is to say, with both real historical interest and some literary shaping, the two difficult to fully separate. What the record shows is a person who died in the manner he had written about dying for decades. He dictated to scribes while his body was failing. He spoke to the people around him with enough composure that those watching found the composure itself remarkable. He asked questions, received visitors, continued, in whatever way was still available to him, the practice that had organized his mornings and evenings for most of his adult life. This is not a story about a death performed for an audience, or at least it is not only that. It is evidence of something the Stoic tradition had been claiming throughout, and that Seneca had staked his philosophical credibility on, that a practice of mortality reflection, sustained over years, actually changes the texture of what dying feels like from the inside. That philosophy is not merely preparation for living, but preparation for this, for the specific moment when the fact that has been held in mind at a comfortable philosophical distance arrives as the immediate, unmediated thing itself. The years of asking the question were the preparation. The death was not the argument. The death was the test. Whether a person accepts the Stoic conclusions about death, that it is simply the cessation of something that was always going to cease, that it belongs entirely to the category of things outside our control, that the equanimity we can bring to its knowledge is the only genuinely useful response to it, is a matter for a different kind of sitting and thinking than can be done quickly. These are not conclusions that arrive overnight, and the Stoics knew this. The practice is daily precisely because the understanding requires time to settle into the body, to become more than a position one holds intellectually, and move toward the kind of knowing that actually changes behavior. But the claim underneath the conclusions, the thing that does not require acceptance of the full Stoic architecture to find useful, is simpler. The hours of a life are irreplaceable. Attention is the only instrument for inhabiting them, and the persistent awareness of the finitude of the time available, held not as a source of dread, but as a clarifying lens, returned to in the morning and examined in the evening and carried lightly through the middle of the day, is the most reliable technique for restoring ordinary experience to its actual weight that the philosophical tradition has produced. Marcus had understood this before sunrise, in his dark room, with the stylus moving across the wax and the names of dead emperors forming under his hand. Epictetus had understood it in the plain room in Nicopolis, in the body of a man who had once been a slave and who knew what it meant to have no external freedom, and had found in that condition a freedom that circumstance could not reach. Seneca had understood it across years of letters, imperfectly, with the gap between the knowing and the doing honestly acknowledged, and had continued writing anyway, because the writing was itself the practice. Each of them, in their own way, was not writing about death at all. They were writing about the morning, about the quality of the attention brought to an ordinary hour when no one is watching and nothing particularly important seems to be at stake, about the specific way that a life looked at, honestly from the inside, becomes vivid or invisible, depending on the one thing the Stoics believed was always within reach, the choice of where to place the mind, and how to carry the knowledge that the time, in the end, is not endless. The lamp on Seneca's table burned. The city outside continued. He set the letter aside and prepared, as he did every evening, to rest. Seneca is writing to a man he knows well, though the man has little time left for letters. His name is Paulinus, and he administers the grain supply of the Roman Empire, a position of genuine consequence, a life spent in the organized movement of necessary things. The essay Seneca is beginning has been forming for some time. It opens without ceremony. Life, he writes, is not short. What we have been given is not meager. What we have done is wasted. The argument arrives without apology. Paulinus would have felt it as a kind of gift, or perhaps as a small shock, the way a cold window feels against the hand on an autumn morning before the temperature has been fully registered. The room around him, its shelves, its afternoon light coming in at the angle it always came in at, the familiar smell of the papyrus and the oil lamp would have shifted slightly in its proportions, not dramatically, but enough for everything in it to become briefly strange. What Seneca is pointing at is not time as a quantity. He is not talking about hours or years. He is pointing at something subtler, the texture of a life as it is actually being lived, from the inside, moment by moment, in the full range of its actual attention. The person who reaches old age, having spent the whole of their days chasing reputation or managing anxiety or postponing the life they meant to live, has not, Seneca argues, actually been living. They have been occupying time. The two are not the same. The Latin title of the essay is De Brevitate Vitae, on the shortness of life. But the shortness is not the point. The shortness is the symptom. The point is the squandering. Paulinus would have read further, into the long middle sections of the essay, where Seneca distinguishes between those who are merely alive and those who are truly living. The first category is immense. It contains the ambitious, the anxious, the greedy, the habitually distracted, the endlessly deferred. The second is smaller, quieter, and constituted not by any particular type of achievement, but by a quality of deliberate presence, the full and conscious occupation of one's own time with what one genuinely, honestly values. The difference between the two ways of being alive is not a matter of wisdom or intelligence or even effort. It is a matter of attention, of where attention goes, and whether it goes there freely. Seneca puts the argument plainly: to allow time to be consumed by things that do not matter, by the demands of people one does not respect, by the postponement of the real life in favor of the imagined future life, is not merely inefficient. It is not a problem of scheduling or priority. It is, he says, the squandering of the only thing that is truly and irreversibly one's own, not money, not property, not the good opinion of the powerful. Time, the hours as they come, the morning, the afternoon, the long evening. Once gone, they are gone without remainder, without appeal, without return. The essay was written sometime in the middle of the 1st century. Paulinus received it, sat with it, and continued, most likely, to administer the grain supply. Philosophy does not often produce immediate transformation. That is not its job. Its job is to place something in the mind that works slowly, like water in stone. There is a question that lives at the center of the De Brevitate Vitae, and that does not announce itself directly. It is the question of what time actually is, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as the material of a human life. What is it exactly that Seneca is asking Paulinus to stop squandering? The hours as they pass contain something, experience, sensation, the texture of being conscious and alive in a particular place at a particular moment. And whatever that something is, Seneca believes it is the most valuable thing a person possesses, more valuable than anything it might be exchanged for, not because it is pleasant, though it may be pleasant, because it is irreplaceable, because there is no reserve supply, because the only thing that can be done with this moment is to inhabit it, and the only question is whether the inhabiting is full or hollow. The argument does not require death to make its point. Death is present in it only as the limit that gives the argument its shape, the horizon that clarifies the foreground. What the awareness of that horizon produces, when it is genuinely held rather than merely acknowledged, is not fear or grief. It is something closer to sobriety, a gentle coming awake, the quality of attention that belongs to someone who has remembered, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, that the afternoon will not repeat itself. In Cambridge in the 1880s, a psychologist named William James was working through a problem that had troubled him for years. He was trying to account, in precise and honest language, for something that nearly everyone experiences, but that almost no one had managed to describe accurately. The phenomenon he was after was the difference in the felt texture of time during childhood and the felt texture of time in adult life. Why do the summers of childhood seem in memory to extend for whole lifetimes? And why do the years of adult life seem to pass with increasing speed, as though the train has been accelerating almost without being noticed? James was writing what would become the principles of psychology. He was surrounded in his study by notes, letters, the usual organized disorder of a mind in the middle of sustained effort. The argument he arrived at was simple in form and strange in implication. The subjective experience of time's passage, he proposed, is directly proportionate to the density of novel and memorable experience within a given period, not calendar time, felt time, the time that leaves a residue. A child encounters novelty in almost everything. The world is continuously surprising. Each week contains its own particular discoveries, its textures and reversals and unexpected encounters. And because the mind is filling itself with new material at every turn, the weeks feel long, they feel full. They feel, in retrospect, like lifetimes, because they were in fact dense with the kind of experience that the memory retains and the self is shaped by. An adult living largely within habituated routine, the same commute, the same conversations, the same reliable pleasures repeated in the same reliable sequence, passes through the same calendar period, the same 7 days, but the mind retains almost nothing. There was nothing new to retain. The weeks do not leave a residue, they pass through the memory like water through a sieve, and in retrospect, the years feel thin, feel fast, feel as though they occurred mostly to someone else. James was not making a moralistic argument. He was observing something about the mechanics of consciousness, but the observation has an edge. A life shaped primarily by comfort and routine, a life organized around the reduction of friction and the maintenance of the familiar, will be experienced as shorter and thinner than a life that continues to seek out genuine novelty, genuine engagement, genuine presence in the moment being currently occupied, not longer in calendar time, longer in lived time, longer in the only time that leaves a mark. The argument settles into something quieter than it first appears. What James is pointing at is not the obligation to be adventurous or to fill life with dramatic new experiences. It is something closer to the quality of attention brought to whatever experience is actually occurring. The ordinary afternoon, met with genuine presence, leaves a different residue than the same afternoon met with habitual distraction. The familiar face really looked at becomes a source of genuine novelty. The walk that has been walked 100 times, actually walked with attention to the specific light and the specific sound and the specific temperature of that particular afternoon, does not dissolve into the general memory of 100 similar walks. It remains. James did not frame this argument in terms of mortality reflection. He was doing psychology, not philosophy, but the convergence with what Seneca had been pointing at 17 centuries earlier is unmistakable. Both men were following the same thread. Both had found that the quality of time is not given but made, that it is made from attention, and that attention, like time itself, is finite and therefore precious in direct proportion to its finitude. Near Todnoberg in the Black Forest, not far from a wooden hut where he did much of his thinking, a German philosopher spent years working through a problem that had occupied European philosophy since at least Aristotle, and that he believed had never been confronted with sufficient directness. The problem was being, not beings, not the things that exist, but existence itself. The sheer fact that there is something rather than nothing, and what it means to be the kind of entity that is aware of its own being and therefore aware that its being has a limit. Martin Heidegger published the major statement of this work in 1927 under the title Being in Time. The argument is dense and technical in many of its parts, but its central insight can be held without the technical scaffolding. What Heidegger was pointing at is this: death is not an event that happens at the end of a life. It is a structural feature of human existence, present at every moment as a horizon, a limit, an orientation. The awareness of this horizon, genuinely held, not merely acknowledged as an abstract fact, is what he called being toward death. And the question he was pressing was whether a person can live in full recognition of this, or whether they will instead flee from it into the comfortable anonymity of absorbed social life, the endless busyness that absorbs the self in things to be done, and opinions to be held, and roles to be played, until the actual fact of being finite is so thoroughly buried that it never has to be faced at all. The word he used for the act of facing it genuinely was Entschlossenheit, resoluteness. Not the dramatic resolution of a crisis or the heroic confrontation with mortality, but something much quieter, the willingness to hold one's own finitude openly, without evasion, and to let that holding shape the character of one's engagement with the actual world. The person who walks with awareness of the path's limit, Heidegger was suggesting, walks differently from the person who pretends the path has no end, not more anxiously, more deliberately, more awake to the specific weight of each step on the actual ground. The Black Forest in autumn would have provided Heidegger with abundant occasions for this kind of thinking. The paths there are old, the trees are large and indifferent. The light in the afternoons comes low and sideways through the canopy, and there is a quality of stillness in those particular woods that has the effect of slowing thought down, of making it heavier and more careful. Whatever argument he was following would have followed him out of the hut and into the trees, and the trees would have done their quiet work on it. What Heidegger was asking is different in its framework from what Seneca was asking, but the pressure it applies arrives in the same place. The question is not whether death is to be feared, or how long one has, or what will be remembered after. The question is whether one is actually living one's own life, or whether the life being lived belongs primarily to habit and convention and the accumulated weight of what one is supposed to be doing. The horizon clarifies the foreground. The limit gives the middle its definition. Without the awareness of the limit, not as an idea, but as a genuine and present fact, the middle can remain indefinitely soft and unspecific and pleasantly vague. And then Heidegger was suggesting something has been missed that cannot be recovered. This is not an argument for urgency. It is not a demand for significance or achievement or any particular shape that a life should take. It is more like a description of a quality of attention, the attention of someone who has genuinely internalized the fact that this afternoon is not a rehearsal and will not be offered again, not dramatically, simply as a texture of consciousness that remains, once genuinely arrived at, and quietly changes the way almost everything looks. In Athens, several centuries before any of this, a man named Epicurus had been working on a different but related problem, and his solution arrived at a surprising place. The problem he was addressing was fear, not death itself, but the fear of death, which he believed was consuming an enormous portion of the psychological energy available to most people, energy that might otherwise go toward the genuine pleasures that constitute a good life. The fear was irrational, he thought, and the irrationality could be demonstrated, and the demonstration, once genuinely understood, would release the fear entirely and leave behind only the spaciousness of a life no longer organized around the avoidance of the unavoidable. The argument he made in his letter to Menocius is called the symmetry argument. It begins with an observation that is simple, but that tends, when genuinely attended to open something unexpected. Before each of us was born, there were billions of years of time, an unimaginable span of existence in which the world proceeded in its full complexity and movement, and in which we were entirely absent. And the notable thing about that vast period of prenatal non-existence is that we feel no anxiety about it. We do not grieve for the centuries we missed before our birth. We do not feel diminished by the long ages that passed without us. The absence from that side has no emotional weight at all. Epicurus sat in his garden and looked up from the letter he was writing and considered this. The garden in Athens was where he taught, and where many of his students lived alongside him, and it had the character of a place where philosophical thinking happened in the long afternoons and continued into the evenings, and was not sharply distinguished from the rest of life. He would have been able to see, from where he sat, the same garden he saw every day, and the familiarity of it, the same trees, the same quality of afternoon light, the same sounds from the street beyond the wall, would have been present as a kind of ground beneath the abstract movement of the argument. The symmetry, he was writing, is complete. Being dead is indistinguishable from not yet having been born. Both are states of non-existence. We approach the first with perfect equanimity because there was no we to approach it. And the same will be true of what lies beyond the end of life. There is no experiencer on the other side of the limit to suffer anything. Death, Epicurus wrote, is nothing to us, not because death is trivial, but because where death is, we are not, and where we are, death is not yet. The conclusion of the argument is not nihilism or resignation. It is more like an opening. If the fear of death is genuinely released, not pushed aside, not managed, but actually dissolved by seeing that the fear is addressed toward a non-event, toward an experience that will not exist because there will be no one to have it, then the enormous psychological energy that has been consumed by that fear becomes available. For what? For the actual pleasures of an actual life. The conversation that extends past the point where it might have ended. The meal that is tasted rather than consumed. The evening that is genuinely inhabited rather than survived en route to the following morning. Epicurus was not a hedonist in the popular sense. The pleasures he was pointing toward were modest and primarily relational. The company of friends, the satisfactions of philosophy, the simple physical pleasures of food and rest, and the good light of a garden afternoon. What he was arguing was that these pleasures are fully sufficient, that a life containing them is a life containing everything necessary for genuine happiness, and that the primary obstacle to inhabiting them fully is the background anxiety about mortality that consumes the attention before it can arrive at what is actually present. The letter to Menicius carries the argument with great care and without urgency, the way a thing is carried when it is genuinely believed. Epicurus had no reason to be rhetorical about it. He had been living by it for years. The garden around him was the evidence. There is a philosophical puzzle about time itself that has been running quietly beneath all of these arguments, and it belongs to a different kind of inquiry from the kind Seneca and James and Heidegger and Epicurus were engaged in. The British philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart, working in the early years of the 20th century, proposed a distinction that became one of the more quietly persistent ideas in the philosophy of time. He called them the A series and the B series, and what he was pointing at was a fundamental tension in the way time appears when examined carefully. The B series is the physicist's view. All moments exist as relations of earlier than and later than. The moment of Julius Caesar's death is earlier than the moment of Napoleon's birth, which is earlier than the moment of this particular evening. All these moments are equally real. None of them is more or less present than any other. The physicist universe is, in a certain sense, static, a four-dimensional block in which every moment simply is at its coordinate without any of them being privileged as the present. The A series is the human view, past, present, and future as genuinely different kinds of time, the present as the only real moment, the past as genuinely gone, the future as genuinely not yet arrived, the irreversibility of time as felt from the inside, the fact that nothing returns, that the afternoon just passed is now unreachable, that whatever was said or done or left undone in it has settled into the fixed and permanent character of what has been. McTaggart's own conclusion from this distinction was that time itself is unreal, that the A series and the B series are incompatible, and that neither can be made fully coherent. Most philosophers have not followed him to that conclusion, but the tension he identified remains, and it is a genuinely productive one. because the human experience of time, the A-series experience, the felt sense of the present as uniquely real, and the past as unreachable, is not obviously reducible to the B-series picture of equally real moments at fixed coordinates in a static block universe. And this irreducibility is not a defect in human experience. It is, possibly, the most important thing about it. What the Memento Mori tradition has always been pressing toward, across its many different forms and cultures, is the full inhabitation of this A-series experience. The insistence that the present moment is genuinely here, genuinely passing, genuinely unrepeatable, not as an argument to generate anxiety, but as an argument to generate attention. The brevity of the passage intensifies the weight of each moment, not despite the irreversibility, but because of it. The fact that this specific afternoon, with its specific quality of light and its specific array of small and large events, will not occur again, this is not a problem. It is the condition that makes the afternoon something rather than nothing. It is the condition that makes it worth attending to. These arguments all arrive at the same place from different directions, but none of them proposes that the place is easy to inhabit continuously. Seneca knew that philosophy and actual daily life are in regular tension with each other. He admitted as much directly in letters written late in his life. The person who genuinely claims their own time, who occupies each day with full philosophical awareness of its irreversibility and its preciousness, is not, he suggests, a figure of achieved and permanent enlightenment. They are a figure of ongoing practice, of returning repeatedly to the recognition that time is passing and that the passing has weight. The practice is the thing, not the moment of recognition, which can arrive and pass without leaving a mark, but the sustained habit of returning to it. The morning that begins with a moment of genuine attention, the meal that is occasionally eaten with full presence, the conversation that is sometimes really listened to rather than occupied with the preparation of a response. These are not grand transformations. They are small adjustments in the quality of a life's attention, and they accumulate. Paulinus would have put down the essay at some point and returned to the administration of the grain supply. The empire needed feeding. The work was real, and the work was his. Seneca was not in the De Brevitate Vitae arguing that the work was wrong or that Paulinus should abandon his responsibilities in favor of philosophical contemplation. The argument is subtler than that. What it asks is whether the work is done with full presence or whether it is done as a postponement of something else, whether the life inside the work, the actual hours, the actual days, the actual texture of the attention brought to bear on the actual tasks, is lived or merely spent. The distinction is fine enough that it can be missed entirely. It does not show up in the outcomes. The grain is administered either way. The letters are written either way. The days pass either way. What changes is something that belongs only to the inside of the experience, a quality of inhabitation, a degree of genuine occupation of the moment being currently passed through. And because this change is interior and produces no visible external difference, it can be indefinitely postponed in favor of more concrete and measurable improvements to one's circumstances. This postponement is what Seneca found most troubling. Not death, which he took to be philosophically straightforward once its nature had been clearly seen, but the ongoing deferral of genuine presence in favor of the next arrangement of circumstances, the next achievement, the next resolution of the current difficulty, after which the real life would begin. The life he was pointing at had always already been available. It was available in the afternoon of the letter's reading. It was available in the morning that preceded it. It is available now, in whatever room, at whatever hour, These words are being heard. There is an ordinary evening that these arguments, all of them, have been circling. It is not a special evening. There is nothing about it that would distinguish it from the hundreds of evenings that have preceded it, or the hundreds that will follow it if they follow it. A meal eaten without particular haste, a conversation that continues past the point where it might have been concluded, not because anything urgent remains to be said, but because neither person is in a hurry to leave what is here. A window left open to the cooling air. The garden sounds arriving through it, irregular and quiet, a bird adjusting its position in a tree, the movement of leaves in a small wind. This evening does not announce itself as significant. It does not carry any of the usual markers that a culture uses to designate occasions for presence and attention. There is no ceremony, no milestone, no collective focus to organize the attention around. It is simply an evening of the kind that most evenings are, ordinary, available, already more than halfway through before the thought arrives to attend to it at all. What Seneca was asking Paulinus to consider, and what James was noticing in his Cambridge study, and what Heidegger was working through in the woods near Todnauberg, and what Epicurus was living in his garden in Athens, all of it is addressed toward this evening, not as a prescription, not as a demand that the evening be experienced in any particular way, or that it achieve any particular quality of significance, but as an observation that evenings like this one are the substance of a life, that they are not the background to a life, or the interval between a life's meaningful episodes, that the texture of this particular hour, its sounds, its temperature, its quality of attention, its degree of genuine presence, is not preparation for anything else, and is not a lesser version of some more important experience. It is the experience. It is where life actually occurs. And what mortality reflection has always been pointing at, in all its forms, across all its centuries and traditions, is not the end of life, but this. The gift is not that life is short, though it is. The gift is not that death clarifies, though it does. The gift is what becomes available when the clarity is genuinely received and genuinely held. The ordinary evening, the familiar face, the meal eaten without hurry, the window open to the night air, restored to its actual weight, its actual presence, its full and unhurried character as a thing that is here now and will not be here again. The window stays open. The sounds from the garden continue. The meal has been cleared, but its warmth has not entirely left the room. Whoever is present has not yet moved toward what comes next, and for the moment is not planning to. The conversation has settled into something quieter than speech. The comfortable silence of people who are not in any hurry to be elsewhere, who have arrived without announcing it, at the kind of presence that all the arguments have been describing. Seneca is in his study, somewhere late in his life, and the letter on the table before him is one of many. He has asked the same question of himself, in many different forms, across many years of writing and thinking, and the question has not changed. It has only grown more patient. Whether the time that has passed has been genuinely occupied, or whether it has been spent, whether the hours have been lived in, or merely survived. The question does not press. It simply remains, open and available, as questions of this kind always do, asking nothing in return for being held, and giving in the holding the quietest and most consistent thing that philosophy has ever given. Not an answer, not a resolution, the quality of a life that has learned to pay attention. The gift of time is not a quantity to be measured or totaled. It is not a number of years or a count of hours. It is a quality of attention that each moment either receives or is denied. And the moment, this one, Whatever it is, wherever it is being encountered, has always been available for that attention. The only question is whether it is actually given. The only occasion for giving it is now, and now, as it has always been, is enough. In a monastery in 8th century Japan, before the lamps were lit, and before the bell had called the monks to their evening duties, a single practitioner settled into the posture that would carry him through the next hour. The stone beneath him held the cold of the season. His breath, finding its depth, slowed. The sounds of the courtyard, footsteps on gravel, the distant call of a bird settling into a tree for the night, arrived and passed without being followed. The body, given nothing urgent to do, began its own unhurried quieting, and in the open space that this quieting made, a single word rose from the practice he had been given and arrived in his awareness, the way a leaf arrives at the surface of still water, without disturbance, without announcement, touching down so gently that the surface barely showed the moment of contact. The word was Anaka. It is a Pali word, old enough that the tradition carrying it spans more than 2.5 millennia. Translated, it names impermanence, the quality of all conditioned things to arise, to persist briefly, and to pass, not as a catastrophe, not as a flaw in the structure of existence, simply as the way things are, seen plainly, without the overlay of protest or the habitual wish that things were otherwise. The practitioner who first encounters this word in its doctrinal form tends to feel something like recognition, not surprise, because on one level everyone already knows that things do not last, but a particular quality of recognition, as if a thought that had always been present just below the surface of daily life has finally been given a name and permission to be acknowledged openly. What the Theravada Buddhist tradition noticed across centuries of practice and careful attention was that the knowledge of impermanence and the felt experience of impermanence are almost entirely different things. The knowledge is easy, it requires nothing. Any person can assent to the proposition that all things pass without that assent changing anything about how the day is lived. But the felt experience, the genuine bodily, unhurried absorption of impermanence as a fact that the practitioner lives inside, rather than observes from a safe distance, this is a different kind of encounter, and the tradition's claim, tested across those centuries, is that this encounter, when it is genuine, does something unexpected. Rather than casting a shadow over present experience, it removes one. The grasping that had been trying to hold things still, the constant exhausting effort to make permanent what was never going to be permanent, relaxes its grip. And in the space that this release opens, the present moment arrives with a quality of richness that the grasping had been, all along, preventing. The monk in his monastery sits with the word. He does not analyze it. He does not build arguments around it. He lets it rest in awareness, the way one might hold a smooth stone, feeling its weight and temperature without needing to describe either. The lamp will be lit soon. The bell will ring. The stone beneath him will remain cold long after he has left his posture and moved into the evening. None of this is in the future. All of it is simply here, in the way that all things are simply here, for exactly as long as they are. Far from that monastery, in a different century, in a different landscape, another kind of attention was being paid to the same quality of transience, and arriving at something that would eventually have its own name. In 18th century Japan, a scholar of classical literature named Motoori Norinaga was working through a text that had been read for nearly 7 centuries without being fully understood. The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century and considered by those who loved it to be something that resisted ordinary categories of description. Norinaga, sitting with the text across years of careful reading, found himself trying to name the quality that Murasaki's prose carried, and that was so distinctly, so undeniably, so deeply Japanese that it seemed to have no equivalent in the Chinese literary traditions that Japanese scholars were trained to use as their critical reference points. What he found, what he gradually circled toward through the text, he called mono no aware. The phrase carries a quality that translation touches but cannot fully hold. Mono means things, aware means a kind of feeling, not grief exactly, not sadness exactly, not beauty exactly, but something that exists where all three meet, a bittersweet quality of perception in which the beauty of a thing and its transience are not separate experiences, but a single unified one. To see a thing as beautiful, Norinaga found in Murasaki's writing, is already to feel its passing, and to feel its passing is not to diminish the beauty, but to see it completely, without the flatness that comes from treating it as permanent, as guaranteed, as something that will be here in the same form whenever one turns back to look. The example that has stayed most vividly in the tradition's memory is the sakura, the cherry blossom lasting in Japan only 1 or perhaps 2 weeks before the petals fall, has been the occasion for centuries of gathering, people traveling considerable distances, sitting beneath the trees, eating and drinking and talking with an intensity of attention that the blossoms seem to require by their very brevity. The important thing is that the gatherings are not despite the fact that the blossoms will be gone within the week, they are because of it. The brevity is not a problem, the gathering is trying to ignore. It is the very thing the gathering honors. The people seated on their blankets beneath the flowering branches know that what they are looking at is already, even now, in the act of ending. This knowledge is not separate from the pleasure. It is the pleasure's depth. A crowd gathering beneath cherry trees in a Japanese garden at the peak of blossom holds something in common with the practitioner sitting with a Nika in the monastery, though the forms are almost entirely different. Both are attending to transience, not as an interruption of experience, but as the precise condition that makes experience available in its full intensity. The blossoms teach the same thing the Pali word teaches, not through instruction, but through presence, through the simple, patient fact of being exactly as they are, exactly as briefly as they are, in a way that asks nothing from the observer except honest attention. Norinaga spent years with this quality, tracing it through Murasaki's prose, finding it in the way her characters move through their grief, their love, their losses, always with this dual awareness, this capacity to feel the beauty and the passing as a single movement rather than two. He was not a Buddhist in his formal affiliations, and he was not making a Buddhist argument. But what he found in the literature he loved, and what he gave a name, was something that the tradition of Anika had been pointing at from a different direction for many centuries. The world is not less beautiful for being transient. It may be that transience is what beauty is. Across time, in a different philosophical lineage, a philosopher with a very different temperament was sitting in the aftermath of loss and working towards something that looked, from the outside, like an unusual kind of equanimity. Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher whose text is named for him, written in China around the 4th century before the Common Era, had lost his wife. The details are sparse, as most details about Zhuangzi are. What survives is the account of what happened when his friend Huizi came to find him and discovered him sitting on the ground, singing, not grieving, not performing composure, sitting and singing. Huizi, who was a logician and had some difficulty with what he saw, asked whether this was not a little much, whether, after a long life together, singing was really the appropriate response. Zhuangzi's answer was not that he had not felt grief. He said that he had. He said that in the first moment, after her death, the grief had been as present and as real as anyone would expect. But then something had happened in his thinking. He had followed the thread of what her death meant all the way back, further than the marriage and the shared life, further than her birth, further than the conditions that had made her birth possible. He had followed it back to the great transformation, the cycling of things that the Tao names and that precedes and follows all individual existence. She had come from that transformation. She had been for a while a person he had loved. She had returned to the transformation, and the grief that remained was still there, but it had become part of something larger than grief, something that included grief, the way a river includes the rain that fell into it, somewhere upstream. The Taoist understanding of death that Zhuangzi was articulating here is not a refusal of feeling, it is a refusal of the frame that makes death an ending rather than a transformation. The Tao, the great way, the underlying current of all things, does not end. It continues in forms that individual attachment has difficulty following, because attachment tends to require the continuation of the specific form. But the Taoist practitioner, trained by long attention to the cycling of things, water becoming cloud, cloud becoming rain, rain returning to river, and eventually to sea, finds in each transformation not a loss but a passage. The specific form changes, the transformation continues, and the grieving person, in following this thread honestly, does not arrive at a place without grief, but at a place where grief has been set within a frame large enough to hold it without being overwhelmed. Zhuangzi is a difficult companion because he refuses to make this easy. He is not consoling Huzi, he is not offering a pleasant idea to ease the discomfort of loss. He is making a philosophical claim about what death is, and he is demonstrating the claim by inhabiting it, sitting on the ground, singing, not because the loss was small, but because the transformation he had followed her into was genuinely, in his understanding, something that could be met with a kind of openness. The question his account leaves open, the honest limit of the Taoist frame, is the question of the individual person who is lost. The transformation continued, but the voice, the particular way she moved through a room, the specific quality of her attention when she listened, these do not return. The Tao does not preserve them. What Zhuangzi found adequate, others might find is not. The frame he inhabited was genuinely his, built from years of philosophical practice. Whether it is available to anyone who has not done that building is a different question, and one the text does not resolve. What it does, though, is hold open the possibility that mourning and philosophical equanimity are not opposites, that the acknowledgement of loss and the acknowledgement of something vast enough to contain loss can exist in the same moment, in the same person sitting on the ground, singing. In Japan, several centuries after Zhuangzi, and within the Buddhist framework that Dogen had inherited and was remaking in his own encounter with it, another kind of reckoning with impermanence was being worked out in the grounds of monasteries and the pages of texts that have not aged the way most philosophical texts age. Dogen was a Zen master working in 13th century Japan, and his understanding of birth and death, he used the Japanese phrase shoji, which carries both, was one of the most demanding things he wrote. Not demanding in the sense of difficult to read, though his writing was also that. Demanding in the sense of asking something of the reader that most philosophical texts do not ask. What he asked was this: To understand birth and death is the most important thing in the life of a monk, not to transcend them, not to solve them, not to find a perspective from which they cease to matter, to understand them, and the understanding he had in mind was not the doctrinal understanding that can be accomplished by reading and assenting. It was the understanding that comes only from full, unguarded presence within birth and death, from not turning away, from not seeking the exit that much of what passes for spiritual practice is quietly hoping to find. Dogen had a particular argument he returned to often, and it is one of the stranger and more insistent claims in the tradition he inhabited. The fully awakened mind does not escape the cycle of birth and death. It finds nirvana within it. This is not the same as saying that nirvana and the cycle of birth and death are the same. Dogen is not dissolving the distinction. He is saying something more precise and more difficult, that the attempt to escape the cycle, to find a place outside it where one is finally safe from impermanence, is itself the obstruction. The monk who walks the monastery grounds looking for the exit is not approaching the awakened mind. The monk who walks the same grounds knowing there is no exit, knowing that this is precisely where the practice lives, this monk is walking differently. The same path, a different walking. Dogen walked those paths in 13th century Japan. The stone beneath his feet was the same stone each morning. The morning bell was the same bell, but the quality of attention he brought to each step was the thing his teaching was trying to pass on, not the doctrines, not the correct understanding of the texts, but the precise way of inhabiting a moment that knows itself to be within birth and death and does not reach past it for something else. Between two steps on a stone path in his monastery, something that he had been thinking for years became briefly completely visible to him. The thought was not new. He had written it many times in many forms, but there are moments in a long practice when something that has been understood conceptually settles into the body in a way that is different from understanding. And what Dogen was walking toward was always this settling, the place where the argument and the step and the stone and the morning cold and the impermanence of all of it became briefly a single undivided fact. The great texts of Zen are full of these moments, the moment of Kensho, the opening, the sudden clarity, but Dogen was careful not to let these moments become their own form of grasping. The opening is not the destination. The settling is not a permanent state to be acquired and secured. The path continues. The bell rings again. Birth and death are still the ground everything is walking on. The practice is not to escape this, but to walk it with open eyes. In a field far removed from these monastery grounds, in a time before monasteries, and in a language that shares none of the specific terminology of either the Buddhist or the Taoist traditions, an army had gathered on a plain in northern India, and a warrior stood between the two opposing lines in a state that the text recording the moment describes as complete collapse. His bow had fallen from his hands. He could not stand. He was overwhelmed by grief and by the impossibility of what was being asked of him, to fight a battle in which on both sides were people he loved. This is the moment at the opening of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, the great warrior, undone. And what happens next is not that someone removes the difficulty or explains it away. What happens is that his friend and charioteer, Krishna, who is also something larger than a friend and charioteer, begins to speak. Krishna's teaching in the Gita is long and moves through many levels, but its foundation is a claim about the nature of the self that is so large in its implications that everything else in the text rests on it. The Atamanan, the deep self, the self that was never born and can never die, is not the body that will fall in battle. It is not the name that will be remembered or forgotten. It is not the relationships that will be severed by death. The fate, id man, is the witnessing presence that inhabits all of this without being constituted by any of it. And because the Atman was never born, it cannot die. The warriors on both sides of the field will die in the sense that their bodies will die. But what they are, in the deepest sense, was never in danger. This is not a consolation in the ordinary sense. It is a metaphysical claim about the structure of selfhood, and the tradition that has carried it for more than 2,000 years has spent those years working out its implications and its difficulties. The most important implication for the Gita's own purposes is what it does to the question of action. If the Atman is eternal, then the grief that is paralyzing Arjuna, grief at the thought of causing deaths, is grief based on a misunderstanding of what death is. The bodies fall. The Atman continues. And this shifts the question from whether to act to how to act, not with attachment to outcomes, not with the ego's investment in victory or survival, but with full presence and full commitment to what the moment requires. The teaching about the Atman in the Gita has been read as consolation, as a way of making death less frightening by making it less final. But this reading misses what Krishna is actually asking of Arjuna. He is not removing the difficulty of the moment. He is placing it within a frame so large that the figure of Arjuna and his grief, real as they are, become for a moment as brief and as complete as a single breath within a breathing that has always been happening and will not stop. This is not comfort in the sense of something that makes the difficulty smaller. It is a shift in scale so complete that the difficulty and the person holding it both become part of something that was not in question. Arjuna is still on the field. The battle is still ahead. The grief is not gone. But the frame it is held in has changed, and the paralysis has lifted, not because the fear has been addressed, but because the self that was afraid has been placed within a context that was never afraid, and never mortal, and was not therefore capable of being lost. The honest difficulty here, the place where this teaching reaches its own edge, is the question of what it means to inhabit such a frame. The Atman is eternal, but Arjuna is still a person on a battlefield, and the people on the other side are still people. The metaphysical claim does not dissolve the ethical weight of the action, it reframes it. Whether the reframing is enough, whether the eternal self can coexist in practice with the full acknowledgement of what the mortal self is asked to do, this is a question the Gita does not fully resolve, and that the tradition has continued to sit with in the centuries since. What it offers, and what is genuinely offered rather than merely claimed, is a perspective from which mortality is not the fundamental fact about a person. The body passes, the name fades. The particular configuration of this life, this grief, this love, this specific and irreplaceable quality of being this person in this moment, all of this is temporary. But the awareness that knows all of it, that was present before any of it and will be present after, is not temporary in the same way. This awareness is what the Gita calls the Atman, and the teaching is that every person in every tradition who has sat still enough and long enough to stop identifying entirely with the passing forms has found something underneath the passing that does not pass. Whether one names this the Atman, or the Tao, or the unborn awareness, or the Dharmakaya, the names belong to different traditions and carry different doctrinal weights. The quality of the discovery, as reported across those traditions, is recognizably similar. The monk in the monastery sits with Anika. The people beneath the cherry trees gather for what is already passing. Zhuangzi sits on the ground after loss and finds within his grief a transformation larger than grief. Dogen walks a stone path between steps that are the same and not the same. Arjuna stands on the field and hears a voice that places his grief inside something older than grief, something that was not born on this battlefield and will not die here. Each of these is a different approach to the same territory, the territory that opens when a person stops fighting with impermanence and begins simply to look at it. What each tradition found, in its own language and through its own instruments, is that the fight against impermanence costs more than the thing being protected. The energy spent grasping at the stability that was never there, trying to hold still what moves, to secure what was never securable, to make permanent what arose from conditions and will pass when those conditions change. This energy is the very thing that stands between a person and the actual texture of the present moment. The monk with Ainaka arrives at the present moment by releasing the fight against impermanence. The people beneath the cherry trees arrive at the beauty of the blossoms by agreeing to be with them only for as long as they last. Zhuangzi arrives at his singing by following the transformation all the way through rather than stopping at the boundary of individual form. Zhuangzi arrives at the walk by agreeing to be within birth and death rather than above them. Arjuna arrives at his action by being placed inside a frame where the fear of loss has dissolved, not because nothing is lost, but because what is lost was always already passing, and what is not lost was never in danger. The temperature of all of these discoveries is not the temperature of resignation. Resignation is a response to defeat, the settling that comes when one has given up. What these traditions describe is something different. The arrival that comes when the fight that was never winnable is finally completely set down. Not because nothing matters, because without the fight, what matters becomes visible in a way the fight was preventing. An ordinary evening in a house, a meal eaten without hurry, a conversation that extends past the hour when it might have ended, a window left open to the air outside, holds within it everything that any of these traditions were pointing at. The meal will be finished. The conversation will end. The night air coming through the window will give way to morning. None of this is secured. All of it is temporary, in the way that all things are temporary. In the way that all things are temporary. And yet, without the grasping that tries to hold it past its moment, what remains is not diminishment, but presence, the specific, unhurried quality of a thing being fully what it is, for exactly as long as it is. The cherry blossom does not apologize for falling. The stone path does not apologize for the steps that have walked it and the steps that will. The great transformation that Zhuangzi followed his wife into does not pause to offer consolation to those who remain. Each of these simply continues, doing what things do, being what things are, in the patient, unhurried way of everything that has stopped needing to be something else. The practitioner who has sat long enough with Annika knows something about this patience. The crowd beneath the cherry trees knows something about this patience. The philosopher who followed grief into transformation knows it, and the monk who found nirvana within the cycle rather than outside it, and the warrior who was placed inside a frame large enough to hold both his grief and the eternal awareness that holds the grief. All of them know, from their different positions within different traditions that have never met and would not recognize each other's terminology, the same thing, that the full acknowledgement of impermanence does not diminish the present moment, that it restores the present moment to its actual weight, that the weight received without the effort to hold it past its time is not a burden, but a gift, something like the gift of being briefly, completely, here. Seneca lies in the dark in Rome, and the city outside is quieter now than it will be again before morning. The sounds that remain are small ones, a cart somewhere on stone, the distant breath of the Tiber, the particular silence that falls over a house when everyone in it has stopped moving. He lies still, and before the sleep comes, the questions arrive. They arrive the way they always do, not with urgency, not with the pressure of things demanding resolution, but with the patience of companions who have kept him company through so many nights that their arrival feels less like interruption and more like the natural completion of the day. Where did he go wrong today? What did he accomplish? What could he have done better? 3 questions, asked in the same order, in the same unhurried voice, every night before sleep. He did not invent them. He had received them from an older tradition, a way of closing the day that philosophers before him had practiced and passed along, understanding that the final minutes before sleep are not a formality to be hurried through, but the one moment in the day when the mind, already loosening its hold on the day's particulars, is most capable of honest looking. Seneca used the darkness for this. He used the silence the city briefly offered. He ran his mind back over the day with the steady, non-condemning attention of someone checking carefully on something they have agreed to care for, and when the checking was done, the night received him. He had written about this practice in his letters, and the writing of it had made the practice feel more his own, not less. There is something that happens when a person articulates in words what they have been doing in private. The practice becomes more deliberate, the intention behind it more visible. He had written to his friend Lucilius that the examined day was not a burden, but a gift to the morning, that a person who had laid down the previous day honestly was better positioned to pick up the next one with clear hands. The letters were addressed to Lucilius, but Seneca had always understood that he was also writing to himself, setting down in careful sentences the things he most needed to hear, the reminders that kept slipping away in the noise of the actual hours and needing to be recovered at day's end, in the quiet, in the dark. The practice he was observing belonged to a long inheritance. The Pythagoreans had recommended it first, as best anyone could trace. Some form of nightly reckoning had been part of the philosophical household for centuries before Seneca took it up, but he had given it its most careful articulation, and what he articulated was not a system of self-punishment, but a discipline of honesty. The 3 questions did not ask for perfection. They asked for an accounting, clear-eyed, willing, patient. The day had been spent somehow. Some of the spending had been deliberate. Some of it had slipped past in the gaps between attention. The accounting before sleep gave the slippage a shape, made it visible, and made it less likely to happen the same way tomorrow. Not because Seneca was trying to manufacture a flawless life, but because a person who looked honestly at their days was simply more likely to spend them with the care they deserved. The darkness of the room held this practice. The quieting city held it. Sleep waited at no great distance, and the questions, once asked and answered in that unhurried way, left the mind not more burdened, but more settled, as if the day had been folded neatly and placed aside rather than left in a heap at the threshold. The Greeks had given something else to this threshold, something older than philosophical practice and stranger than it. Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death, were twins in their mythology, children of night, and they moved through the ancient imagination as near identical figures, winged, gentle, and indistinguishable at a certain proximity. The poets knew them well. Hesiod set them in the same breath. Homer sent them together to carry fallen warriors from the battlefield, their arms interlaced, their purpose indistinguishable at the moment of the work. What this pairing meant was not merely that sleep resembled death in a poetic sense, though it did. The lying down, the closing of eyes, the surrender of the body to something larger than its own intention. What the pairing carried was something more careful than metaphor. It carried the intuition worked into the deepest structure of the culture's thinking about rest, that every night the waking self was briefly released, that the person who lay down in the evening was not quite the same person who would rise the next morning, that something was let go in the interval and something was received, and the distinction between that small nightly release and the final one was a matter of degree rather than kind. This intuition did not belong only to the Greeks. The Upanishad described deep dreamless sleep as a kind of temporary return to the undivided ground from which individual consciousness arose, not a loss of self, but a rest from the boundary the self normally maintained between itself and everything else. In certain strands of the Hindu philosophical tradition, this nightly dissolution was understood as a small gift, a regular reminder that the boundaries of the individual were not as absolute as the waking day made them feel. The boundary relaxed in sleep. The urgency of the separate self, with its needs and its projects and its lists, grew quiet. And what remained in the quiet was not nothing, but something older and less named, something that the person would carry back into the morning without quite being able to say what it was. Indigenous traditions across widely separated geographies held versions of this same understanding, that the night was not merely an absence of day, but a distinct and instructive territory with its own relationship to the questions that the daylight hours could not address with the same honesty. Sleep crossed a threshold. Sleep visited something. Sleep returned the dreamer, slightly changed, slightly more porous at the edges, slightly more in contact with the parts of existence that the waking mind kept carefully organized and at arm's length. The crossing happened every night, and the fact that it happened every night meant that the threshold was not rare. It was ordinary. It was the most ordinary thing in a human life, the one practice undertaken without exception, the one surrender made regardless of circumstances. The threshold between waking and sleep was not a special moment. It was the recurring moment, available without preparation or effort, built into the structure of being alive. What the philosophical traditions had done with this recurring moment was to make it deliberate, to notice it, to use the noticing. In the 6th century, a monk named Benedict set down a rule for the communities of men who would live under his guidance, and among the many prescriptions for how the hours of a monastic day were to be spent, he included one for the last minutes before sleep: the examination of conscience, a deliberate review of the day, conducted in the privacy of the monk's own awareness, asking not only where one had fallen short of one's intentions, but also what had been received, what had been given, how the hours had been inhabited. The practice was devotional in Benedict's framing, but its structure was philosophical, and the insight embedded in it was the same one Seneca had arrived at from a completely different direction in a completely different century. The end of the day was the right moment for this kind of looking. The mind on the edge of sleep had already partially released the day. It was reviewing from a slight distance, which was exactly the distance honesty required. Too close, and the looking became defensive. Too far, and the day lost its specificity, its texture, its particular joys and particular failures that made it a day rather than a duration. Benedict was building on an older monastic inheritance and adding to it a systematized structure, and the communities of monks who followed the rule carried the practice forward through the medieval centuries and into the present. Across 1400 years of institutional observance, the nightly examination before sleep had been performed in stone cells and wooden dormitories and quiet chapels, in summer light and deep winter dark, by people who knew each other and people who had no one, by the old and the young and the dying. The practice persisted because it worked, not in the sense that it solved anything or answered anything, but in the sense that a day closed with honest attention felt different from a day that simply ended. The difference was quiet and not always easy to name, but it was there. Sleep arrived on the nights the practice was kept as something already begun. There is a word the ancient Greeks had for a particular quality of time, and it stood in deliberate contrast to the ordinary time measured by clocks and calendars. Chronos was the time of sequence, one thing after another, the hours accumulating, the years adding up, the linear march of before and after that makes history possible and also makes it heavy. But Kairos was something else. Kairos was the time of the significant moment, the opportune instant, the point in the sequence when something that mattered was possible and then briefly was, and then was past. Kairos could not be measured in hours. It could not be saved up or scheduled. It arrived inside chronological time and was not the same as it. A conversation that became genuinely honest, a morning of unusual clarity, the moment when grief broke open and something underneath it became visible. These were kairotic moments, not longer than other moments in clock time, but denser, more inhabited, carrying more of what a human life is actually made of. The Memento Mori tradition, from the slave whispering beside the Roman chariot to the meditator sitting with a single word before dawn, had always been about kairos inside chronos. It was not primarily concerned with the amount of time a human life contained. It was concerned with the quality of attention brought to inhabiting that time. It was pointing at the difference between a life spent moving through hours and a life spent actually inside them, present to the specific weight and texture of each one, not as an achievement of special effort, but as a natural consequence of understanding that each hour was not rehearsal for a different hour, but was itself the thing. This is what the hourglass in the Dutch painter's studio was saying, beside the guttering candle and the flowers already bowing at the stem. Not that life was ending, not that beauty was sad because it was brief. It was saying that the quality of the moment in which a person looked honestly at an overturned hourglass was utterly different from the quality of the moment in which a person did not. The looking changed the moment it looked at. The awareness of brevity did not diminish the candle's light. It gathered it. It made it more fully itself. Kairos was not a philosophical luxury available only to those with time for reflection. It was available at the edge of sleep, in the 3 quiet minutes before the night received the day's last weight. It was available in the examination of conscience, in a stone cell in the 6th century, and in a letter composed by lamplight in the 1st. It was not a complicated practice. It required only the willingness to pause at the threshold and ask what the day had been, what it had offered, and what had been received, what had been given, and what had been withheld from oneself or from others. The asking did not require wisdom to begin. The asking produced it, gradually, over many nights of honest return. What the philosopher Bronnie Ware came to understand through her years of working with people at the end of their lives was not a discovery, but a recovery, the surfacing of something that had been present all along and overridden. She listened to people for whom the future had become very short, and she wrote down what they said about what they wished had been different, and the pattern that emerged was not about achievements or possessions or the arc of a career. It was about the same things the Stoics had been pointing at, and the Buddhist teachers had been pointing at, and Seneca had been pointing at in his letters to Lucilius before either of them was born. The wish to have been more genuinely present to the people in front of them, the wish to have expressed with more honesty what they actually felt, the wish to have spent less time in the performance of a life and more time in the actual inhabiting of one, the wish to have rested more, not in the sense of having been less active, but in the sense of having worried less, resisted less, performed less, allowed things to be more as they were. What she was hearing was not regret about the content of a life. It was regret about the quality of attention brought to the life that had already been lived. The psychologist Laura Carstensen had arrived at a related understanding from a different direction. She had spent years studying how the awareness of time's remaining span affected the priorities people chose and the things they found meaningful. What she found was that as the sense of remaining time contracted, whether through age or illness or any other circumstance that made the horizon visible, people reliably moved toward the things that mattered most. The social and emotional priorities that had been present all along, quietly insisting on their importance, finally received the attention they had always deserved. The relational, the expressive, the present, the genuinely felt, these things had not become important at the end of a life. They had always been important. What changed was simply that the horizon had become visible, and the visibility had dissolved the habit of postponement. This was the function of mortality reflection at its most practical. Not to produce anxiety about endings, but to bring the horizon gently into view while there was still time to live toward what the horizon revealed. The nightly examination, the 3 questions in the dark, the kairotic pause before sleep, these were small, available practices that moved the horizon into the present, not as threat, not as reminder of loss, but as clarification of what was already true and already mattered and had only been waiting with great patience for the attention it deserved. The night continued outside the window. It always does. Stars moved their ancient, unhurried course across the dark, the same stars that had turned above Seneca's Rome and above the monastery where Benedict's monks lay in their stone cells, and above the garden in Athens where Epicurus had looked up from his letter and found in the thought of prenatal non-existence not terror but spaciousness. The same stars that had been present over every evening examination and every honest laying down of the day that had been conducted across all the centuries, this tradition had persisted. The stars did not hurry. They did not arrive at their positions with urgency. They moved in arcs that required no witness to continue, arcs that had been continuing before human eyes were present to observe them and would continue long afterward, with the same steady indifference to whether anyone was watching. The garden outside breathed. The things growing in it, whatever they were, whatever season held them, were conducting their slow, unhurried business entirely without reference to the philosophical questions that had occupied the waking mind. A plant does not engage with the question of whether its time is well spent. Its time simply is its time, and the spending of it is identical with the living of it. There is something in this that the meditators and the Stoics and the Vanitas painters and the monks were all, in their different registers and languages and centuries, trying to approach from the human side. The attempt to inhabit time without division, without the inner negotiation between the life being lived and the commentary on it, between the experience and the part of the mind watching the experience and deciding whether it is enough. Sleep moved toward this. Sleep moved toward the plant's relationship with time, undivided, without commentary. The mind on the edge of sleep had already partially completed the dissolution of the division. The arguments that had pressed for resolution earlier in the evening were already softening. The narratives about the day and the week and the year were releasing their grip. What remained was older and quieter, What remained was the actual fact of being alive in this particular moment of the world's long night, the actual fact of breathing, of warmth, of the body at rest against whatever surface held it, of the continuing darkness outside and the continuing stillness inside. Seneca, in his letters, had made a distinction that he returned to many times in many forms, and the distinction was between the person who was merely alive, occupying time with the default movements of a life, reacting, postponing, distracting, accumulating, and the person who was truly living, which he defined simply as the full and deliberate occupation of time with what one genuinely valued. The distinction was not moral in the way a commandment is moral. It was practical in the way a direction is practical. It pointed at something available. It did not require exceptional circumstances or unusual intelligence or a philosophical education. It required only the willingness to look, before the night received the day, at how the day had been spent. The looking took almost no time. That was perhaps the strangest and most generous feature of the practice. 3 questions, held with honest patience in the dark before sleep, were sufficient. Where did today go wrong? What was accomplished? What could have been done differently? The asking took minutes. The effect accumulated over months and years into something that resembled wisdom, not the wisdom of accumulated information, but the wisdom of a person who had spent many consecutive nights in honest relationship with their own days, and had gradually, without drama, become more present to them. This was the form the gift of time took at the threshold of sleep. Not more time, not time extended or preserved or made to feel longer than it was, but time that was more fully inhabited, more honestly received, given back to the morning with a clearer understanding of what it was for and what it was asking from the person moving through it. The gift was always available. It had always been available. It had been available in Rome in the 1st century, and in Florence in the 14th, and in a monastery garden in the 6th, and in a Dutch painter's studio in the 17th. It had been available in every culture that had looked honestly at a human life and asked what a human life was for. And all of those cultures, without prior agreement, without shared language, or shared history, or shared cosmology, had arrived at something similar, at the same quiet instruction, offered from many directions in many voices, that the awareness of passing was not the enemy of living, that the skull beside the candle was not there to frighten, but to illuminate, that the slave beside the chariot was not there to diminish the general's triumph, but to make the triumph real, to give it the weight and texture that only the knowledge of its brevity could provide. The instruction was not complicated. It had been made complicated by repetition, by the accumulation of philosophical apparatus, by the natural human tendency to reach for more elaborate understanding when a simpler one would serve. At the base of it all, stripped of the Latin and the Pali and the German and the Dutch, was something that could be said in an ordinary sentence in any language. Each day is the material of a life. Look at it with care. Lay it down honestly at the end. That was all. That had always been all. The rest was commentary, and the commentary was beautiful, and the commentary had kept the instruction alive across the centuries, and the commentary could rest now. Outside the window, the night continued. The stars moved,